all be silent.
And then
For
send me
this Hangout on Air is live. Welcome,
Send me
Internet, to our sound test.
Send me the plugin, the link.
Oh,
I mean,
God. Hold on.
dude.
The one random person will pop up now.
You're so needy.
The one person that subscribed. Like,
Bring
wait
us
a minute,
live. Give me the
they're
link.
back. They're online.
Are people actually going to be listening while we're talking?
No.
Sometimes.
I think when we were more regularly recording, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a few.
Sometimes our buddy Russ joins in and watches.
He hasn't been around much either, though. So.
All right. Ready? Are you good, Chris, or no?
I was tweeting it out.
Yeah. Okay. Let me know when you're done tweeting. The whole internet is waiting for you.
Yes.
I know.
And make sure Fritz retweets it. And don't forget to do a hashtag TechBash. DevOps.
Don't give them the link to join, though. Didn't you do that the last time?
Yes.
Yeah.
We had a whole big audience that time. That was actually fun, though.
That was another show. That was the first show that didn't go live.
Oh, I thought the one went live. We never did that one?
She sells seashells. Am I supposed to do that stuff like she sells seashells by the seashore?
Yeah. So let's talk about the new doctor. What do you think?
Lemon face, tiger face. Lemon face, tiger face.
Are we good? Are we good, Chris? We're all waiting on you. The whole internet.
So, Mr. Robot, you watch Mr. Robot?
Mr.
No.
Robot's a-
No, you don't. Well, I'm sorry. We're going to have to cancel.
Yeah, right. We're gonna cancel the show. Sorry, everyone.
You need to watch Mr. Robot.
I watch
All right, ready?
Supergirl.
Watch what?
Supergirl.
Oh,
Ready?
Like that.
we really got to cancel the show now.
Gentlemen.
Look,
All right, ready? 3, 2, 1. Hello, and welcome to the Static Void Podcast. I'm Jess Chadwick,
I'm Todd Snyder.
And I'm Chris Gomez.
and we are your hosts. We are recording this on the evening of July 20th, 2017, and tonight we've got our guest speaker, Andy Schwam, on the show. Andy, welcome. Andy is a longtime contributor to the development community, 8-time Microsoft MVP, and actually, Andy and I are two of the founders of the Tech Bash Developer Conference in the Poconos in Pennsylvania. It's actually coming up here in the first week of October. Go and get your tickets now, techbash.com. But most importantly, and the real reason that we actually brought on the show is that Andy is a dev manager and a software architect who actually writes code and is actually responsible for shipping software into production, right? That's what we like to do on this show, real world, focus on the real world. So we brought Andy on the show to talk about how he does, quote, DevOps in the real world, right? So DevOps is a big buzzword these days. And so we're not really talking about like the DevOps that Microsoft and Google and Facebook and Netflix talk about, you know, the ideal, the unicorn DevOps, but really the kind of DevOps where you actually have to ship some code on a daily or weekly or monthly basis to please your boss. And, you know, in the real world, we end up making some compromises along the way. So, Andy, I'm kind of making fun of the term DevOps. Why don't you kick us off by just what does DevOps mean to you? You know, what is your definition of DevOps, and do you even care about the definition? Or
Yeah, well, first off, thanks for having me, guys. It's good to be here.
Thanks for being here.
Glad to be back.
Yeah, so I actually was thinking about this today in preparation for coming on the show. I was thinking about DevOps and what does it mean? To some degree, it's just a buzzword, right?
Yeah.
It's like the new version of something that we've been doing for a while, right? At first, I was thinking about like it doesn't really mean anything. Then I was thinking about comparing it to, you know, ALM and SDLC and those things, and like how does it fit in? And I guess what I was thinking about, if you're really when regardless of what it, you know, maybe what it really means, but I think when people talk about DevOps, they're talking about what we used to call ALM, application lifecycle management, and a little bit of SDLC. And I kind of came up with some places where they all differ. But I think with DevOps, it tends to imply doing these things in the area of like agile development, right? With rapid development cycles and things like that. I think that's sort of DevOps is like the flavor of how we build software, but in an agile way, as opposed to maybe the way we used to do it. When we used to use words that we can't use anymore, or acronyms we can't use anymore, like ALM or SDLC. You know, if you do that, you must not know what you're talking about because that's the old school. But you know, it's kind of the same thing to some degree, and there are some subtle differences.
I've seen a lot of release management teams, the teams in some big enterprises who are used to just taking code from developers and pushing it into production. Basically they're responsible for production, and they just rebranded themselves as the DevOps team. Yeah, which really kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, right?
I think one of the aspects of what makes it DevOps as opposed to the other stuff is that the developers are really more involved, right? That's the dev part of DevOps. Whereas when it was ALM or whatever you were calling it, maybe in those days you were handing off your code to somebody else and they were taking care of the deployment part of it or something like that. I think when you're in the DevOps world, one of the things that you see used a lot in the DevOps world is that DevOps represents a loop, as opposed to, and I guess it's a different way of thinking, but when we called it ALM, I think we were thinking of it more linearly, right? Yeah, if that's a word, linearly. Right. So you get design, and then you get requirements, whatever, and then you build it, and then you test it, and then you ship it, and you were kind of thought of as done. Right.
There's a beginning and an end.
Yeah, there's a beginning and an end. And as software developers, we know that there really isn't really an end, right? But I think DevOps, where it does have some meaning as a word, DevOps, I think it embraces that loop. The fact that after you ship it, you're not done. Yeah. You're going to analyze it. Also, DevOps puts more of an emphasis traditionally, especially the way I was first introduced to DevOps. I think this is a piece that a lot of people leave out, which is the monitoring aspect. When DevOps first was pitched to us, I remember a lot of, well, we're going to have instrumentation of how people use the software, and not just bugs, but like really like what buttons are they clicking? Really good analysis. Yeah. And I think most people, I could be wrong, but again, real world we're talking about, I think most people leave that part out. Mm-hmm. For good or for bad. I'm not saying that they should, but I think most people leave out that instrumentation part. But then in DevOps, we do get back into that. Okay, we shipped it. Now we're going to modify it, and we're going to go back to the beginning of the loop again and start all over again, right? And we're doing that in a rapid fashion. And to me, that's sort of DevOps. Everything else is just tools that help you do it.
Right. So you consider it the full ALM. So you consider both the development activities and the commits and the builds and everything. That's all part of the DevOps loop, the DevOps cycle, or is it focused more on the release aspect?
No, I think I tend to include the whole thing now. Yeah. You can break it into chunks and focus on different aspects of it at different times. But I think of DevOps as a little bit of the whole thing. And I was looking, again, I said I was looking earlier today to think about certain things. And when you look at SDLC as a phrase, that tended to include a lot more requirements, and also like even user training was part of like SDLC. Yeah. User training, I don't hear talked about in DevOps world. Yeah. So like it does leave some things off, and I don't think really requirements gathering is too much in the DevOps world. But if you look at the loop, one of the parts of the loop would be like plan. Mm-hmm. And so is plan requirements? I mean, I think that it's a gray area, but I think DevOps in general has less emphasis on requirements and more on the technical stuff. Yeah. Right?
So tell me a little bit about your environment. And I know we all have kind of a rule on this show that we don't really talk about our employers. So we're trying to ask you to give me kind of a specific real world example without actually giving away, anything about your employer. But do you have separate development teams and operations teams? You have separate people who are responsible for managing production infrastructure and are very interested in what goes on there and like to control it. And then is that separate from your development team? Are they like two separate entities, or? You know, or yes, there are, but you have a very good relationship, or like how does that work? Who manages your environment and who manages your code?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, without talking about my employer, but where I work and where we do things, we do it right. We do it perfectly.
Yeah.
And so,
sure. So that's the assumption.
Right. I just want to get that out there. Like
that's why we wanted to get you on the show. We finally
'cause
found someone who does it perfectly.
Yeah.
So
And
I
we
should
really
start
think
out by
that's
saying though that I work at what I would call like a mid-sized company, and I think that's important, right? Because what you do and the size of the company really, I think, impacts how you want to do these things. For example, we don't make one product, right? We work in one industry, but as developers, we work on I can't even guess how many applications we work on, right? Internal applications, external applications, web applications, mobile applications, right? Whereas some companies, and you mentioned earlier in the introduction, when you talk about these like ideals of DevOps and perfection, a lot of those places work on one piece of software.
Right.
And I think that has a lot to do with it. So I'm just sort of setting the stage here. So I work on it's not a huge operation. I think there's about 100 people in the IT department, right? And that gets you to what you're asking next. Is when I say IT in our group, we have in the IT department developers. We actually have business analysts in the IT department, QA, and we have what we call the infrastructure team, right? Which is the ones that are responsible for the servers and things like that. And so, getting to what you were trying to get at, I think, is that I don't have the keys, as I always call it. I don't have the keys to the production machine, right? And I like it that way. I think that's a good way to do things. And so
you don't get the pager,
right? I don't get the pager, right? But we have a really good relationship. We have a really nice working relationship, and we work together well, and we help each other. And when it comes to this kind of stuff, the developers are generally really work hand in hand. When it comes to deployments, I mean, we work really hand in hand with the operations team or the infrastructure team, as we call them.
Yeah, cool. So how do you work with them? Do you have there's two sides of it: process and tools, right? So I guess would you kind of talk about the process and then talk about how you've incorporated some of the tools to help make that possible or make it easier or more efficient?
Yeah, great. And I think you hit on something pretty good there too. Process and tools. DevOps, we think of it as and continuous integration and continuous delivery, and these phrases we use. We tend to think of them as development things, or things that developers do, right? But they're really more. I think these days they're more akin to like a methodology. Right? Like we are agile where I work, right? We're an agile shop. We're somewhat agile. We're pretty agile. We're getting more and more agile, by the way. But this whole idea of DevOps or continuous delivery or really the team has to embrace. I think that's important to think about. If I say we're doing DevOps, that's not really good enough, right? Yeah. We have to have the other teams involved and things like that. So how do we do things? So we run currently 2-week sprints. And we develop software, we test it. We have continuous integration set up. So when we check in code, let me also stop myself and say, when I talk about these, I'm going to talk about the best situations that we have. We have plenty of situations, plenty of software applications that we're developing that haven't been brought up into this perfect scenario yet, right? It's not easy. Jumping in and trying to take a lot of brownfield applications to this place, right? One of the things I talk about in a lot of my talks, I'll say like, well, this is easy, and doing continuous integration is easy, and doing unit testing is easy, and doing automated deployments is easy. I think a lot of that stuff's easy. Putting it all together, though, and easy is a relative term, but putting it all together and like making it work in an department of 100 people and making the whole thing flow is really hard,
right,
and painful. But so under our best situations, we have code that gets checked in. We have automated builds. We have tests that run. We have automated deployments that go out to what we would call our sys-test environment, or a lot of people call it like an integrations environment, where the software gets deployed to. And then at a certain point, we push a button and it goes to QA. And we push a button and it goes to UAT. And we push a button. Well, we don't push a button to go to production. I don't, because I can't push that button. But what I can do is put together a release request with the instructions, and then the operations team or the infrastructure team will actually do the production deployment for us. And the cool part about it is, under our best applications, the instructions we send them went recently, within a year and a half or so, from being a full page of instructions to a link.
Yeah.
Which is basically like, go to Octopus Deploy and click this button.
Yeah, I've noticed that theme from a lot of people that I've spoken with. That seems to be a very common theme, and almost like a metric of success of how well you're doing this, right? How much you actually have to write down or document, and watching that kind of shrink over time as it's just automated. And then rather than 4 pages of instructions, you're saying click this button or hit this URL.
Yeah, because that's where the problems are, right? The problems are that list of instructions. One of the things I want to talk about is, why is this idea of DevOps important, right? Why do I care about DevOps? And I'm a developer first, right? I like to write code. I don't really like DevOps, quite frankly. I don't want to be doing that stuff. What I want to be doing is writing code.
Right.
But I can't write code when I'm busy dealing with production deployment problems, and when I'm dealing with failures of applications and all these kind of things and all the noise that goes around writing software. So when you embrace DevOps and you embrace these practices, you write it once and you get it working. You build a process, and the process just takes over. And our process works great. I mean, we rarely have deployment problems. And then what that does is that frees me up to be the developer, to do the things I want to do and write code. And, I start by saying I don't really like DevOps. Well, now I kind of do, because the tools have really come a long way. But trying to do this in the past was a real struggle. You'd have to put a lot of time into it. So DevOps, to me, is one of those things that like frees me up to do the part of the job that I really want to do, which is write software and deliver software.
So I thought it was kind of interesting. You really touched on something key in the beginning about software development lifecycle and ALM. It sounds like the way you look at DevOps is it's more like a methodology. It's the approach of how you deliver software. When I think a lot of people think of DevOps, like if someone asked me the definition of DevOps, I would think it would be more about automation. I'm automating those manual steps I used to have to do that I didn't want to do. All right, I have to get something to QA. I have to get something to production, or there's a problem in production. Now I need to get the right information. To me, originally, my concept of DevOps is I've automated from the build to the deployment, where you seem to be talking more about this whole methodology. You bought into the whole, like people have bought into it. You talked about the need for people to buy into it. And I've always found that is the real challenge. It's not, software has been around for a while to make all this work. It's a people problem. Getting people to buy into it, getting people to embrace it, and getting people to do what they need to do to make it work.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what you mentioned about the automation is certainly like a key aspect of it, right? But to me, maybe I'm blurring the lines between what's officially written down as agile methodology and what's DevOps and things like that. But to me, when you consider that loop, that DevOps loop, it really gets into that methodology mindset, right? And you could say, well, if the rest of the team isn't on board, then what's the point of my having automation? Or if the rest of the team isn't embracing it, they're not going to let me automate the things, right? Because I don't, like I said, I don't have the keys to the production servers, right? So I can't just, no matter how we want to deploy applications, it's not really up to me. So we got to convince everybody. Everybody has to embrace the process, and things start to move fast. That's one of the great things about it, is it enables you to move fast. It enables you. Maybe there's, they are separate, but you can't. It's hard to do agile well without something like this. Like this is sort of it's like an enabling methodology, like a sub methodology or something. We can put new phrases on the show.
And the idea of agile is you're doing the right things at the right time. So by automating something or getting everyone to agree on a methodology, you're avoiding the time it takes to everybody stop. Let's go fix production, or let's go fix the database, or these other things
Well,
that
let's
don't
go fix
control, per se.
staging,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah,
mean,
automated deployments are. It's like the greatest thing. It's so awesome. When I talk about automated deployments at user groups and stuff like that, I like to tell a story about, I said, well, who likes doing deployments? Or better yet, who likes getting a phone call in the middle of the night that the deployment failed, or walk into the office the morning after the deployment and all geared up to work on the next, let's say it's a new sprint and I'm all geared up to start writing code, and you lose a day or a half a day or whatever, or just ruins your morning because things are down, right? And so, I hate that, right? And I've built plenty of that.
I've also been on teams where, the development team, we have a very strict and rigid waterfall approach where we have these phases, and we've gone through 3, 4, 5 weeks of QA testing, and the QA testers and everyone else has signed off on it and said, this is good. There are no bugs. We're good. And yet I have conversations with the team because the team wants to come in on release day and make sure they're around. And I said, you literally, we've been testing this for 4 months. You literally do not have access to production and can't do anything if we do find an issue. By definition, if we find a coding issue on release day, we got to go back through the cycle. We can't just hack and fix real quick. It has to go.
What were all those guarantees worth? What were all the sign-offs worth?
Yeah, right.
If you're that afraid of the deployment.
That's one aspect of it. What's the worth of the QA sign-off if we're still afraid? But why are you there, right? Why are you getting called? Why are you involved when you just shouldn't be, right? And so I think that's not exactly the point that you're making. Very, very much related, though. It's just development teams should be focusing on development, not managing stuff in production. By the time it gets into production, it should be nailed down. It should have high confidence.
Check in the box.
Yeah, but how it gets to production, there's when it gets to production, but there's how it gets to production.
Yeah.
And the biggest problem with deployments is us human beings. Like, we will make a mistake one day. If we don't make it tomorrow, it'll be the next day. And if it's not the next day, it'll be the day after that, because I wrote the instructions and there's 25 steps involved to get this application into production, and I forgot one. Or the person who was executing my instructions skipped a step, or because the phone rang, right? Not because he or she's a bad person, right? They're good at their job, but the phone rings and they miss something, right? Or there's a misunderstanding in the instructions. I thought it was clear what I meant, and when they got it, what they meant was something different.
Yeah, interpretation.
So taking that out, and taking that room for error out, it's really liberating, right? Once you get that thing, like when we have deployment, we've had bugs after deployments, of course.
Sure. Yeah.
But the problem, I would say, very rarely is the deployment itself, right? Ever since we've gone to, really doing some automated stuff, I sleep well. Like, I'm coming in the next day knowing that things are going to be okay. And it's great. And I think I also try to, if you talk about the whole cycle of things, and let's say unit testing, if you embrace unit testing, right? To me, automated deployment is like unit testing for your deployment, because you've tested it, you've done it, and it broke. Like the first time you did it, it didn't work right. Yeah. And so you fixed it and you tweaked it and tweaked it, whatever. It's not exactly unit testing, but you know what I mean? Like you've proven that it works. That's what unit testing does. It proves that your code works.
And so I think that was one of the big reasons that team of developers really insisted on coming in, is because the problems that the most widely the problems that we mostly came across were misconfigurations or bad installations, sometimes bad data, but basically environmental or installation deployment issues. And so they felt like they needed to be on hand to basically explain, well, this application calls this data and it does this, this, and this, to help troubleshoot those issues so that other teams, engineers, the folks with actual access to production, had a better shot at kind of tracking that stuff down and addressing it. So how do you manage that? How do you manage the differences in the different environments as you progress through them, right? Like dev, QA, or test environment, and then finally production. So you mentioned, unit testing of the deployment, which is awesome. It's an awesome idea. And so presumably you're unit testing that deployment in each environment as you move up, right? So how do you kind of guarantee that unit test that you're executing of your deployment is actually working as you go through the environments to the point where you have a very high level of confidence once you get to the final environment of production?
So I think that one of the first things you have to do, and it's easier said than done when you have large, let's say, infrastructure, whether it's virtual or not. Our stuff's all virtual, but there's still virtual servers that have been around a while, and I didn't have control on them when they were created, and so a lot of happened along the way. But the first and the best way to ensure success is to make sure that the hardware, whether it's virtual or not, but the server is the same in QA as it is in production, and all the way along. Because plenty of places, and we've got a couple examples, say, oh well, yeah, the QA server is running 2008 server or whatever, and the production one is running the newest 2012 or whatever version it doesn't matter.
Different version of SQL Server or something, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and different. Oh,
Right.
definitely different versions of SQL Server and all those kind of things, right? And so immediately you're sort of behind the 8 ball, because the likelihood that, like, you don't want to have to introduce change along the way. You don't have to say, well, when we deploy to QA, we do it this way. And when we deploy to,
all you're doing is testing the deployment to QA.
yeah, that's right. You're not
testing the
anything.
deployment to prod.
The other thing, I think I want to go back a step, because I should have thought of this first. I think the first and most important thing to do when we're deploying an application, if that's what we're deploying, is that application shouldn't change between environments. So what we do, and I think a lot of people do this, right? I didn't invent any of this stuff, of course, that, right? Like,
Oh man,
right? No, I mean, like, you don't want to come
thought you had the patent on it
now and be like, I know how to do this. I know how to do this because I listen to other people tell me how to do it, right?
Right.
But I felt the pain when it was doing wrong.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And actually, the best way to learn it and to understand it is to go through the problems, right? You learn a lot through that. But we compile once, right? And then I've heard a lot of people say, well, then we go back and we do a new build for production or for whatever other environment. We build once, we create a DLL or whatever that is, right? And we move that from environment to environment. We never go back and change it in between environments. That's like the first thing. Then we try to have consistency between our environments. So we're getting there. We're pretty close with that. And then we have a consistent deployment process where the deployment, I also like with a lot of these things, I embrace single responsibility in my software development, right? So I want to embrace single responsibility in some of the tooling as well, right? And so we use a tool. Well, we use a couple of tools. I use TFS. I use Octopus Deploy, and that's just generally the stuff we use. So we have TFS that does our builds, and it pushes it into Octopus to do the deployments. And Octopus is pretty good at changing configuration values, and that's about all we change from environment to environment is a configuration file, right? The database connection, the connection to some web service or something like that. That's about the extent of what we change when we go from one environment to another. And that was really the question you asked, is how do we keep things consistent? The way to keep it consistent is really try not to touch anything.
Yeah.
Immutable artifact.
Yeah, it's an artifact that goes from that you build and it ends up going all the way to production. I think it's super important.
So how also along with immutability, versioning, how do you treat versioning? How do you handle versioning? How do you version your software, and how do you kind of what do you do with that version as it progresses through the life cycle?
Yeah, so we use first of all, it's important to say that the software we write, because again, different prescription for different environments, right?
Sure.
The software that we write, the version is only important to us. Meaning we don't make this big announcement like we're releasing 2.5 this week, right? So I can use
it's not a marketing version.
What's that?
It's not a marketing version.
It's not a marketing version, right? So when I say the version, I can do what I want with the version numbers, and that actually really is helpful. So, and I lost my track. So, so what were we talking about?
Version. How do you manage versions?
So what we do is, well, so a lot of that gets into branching, I think, right? If you're talking about that level of the versioning, right? How do we do our branching? Which there's a million different ways to do branching, and there's a million different ways to do deployments. What we do is we use the terminology like trunk and things like that, which you could say is outdated or whatever, but we still call the trunk the base of our code. We tend to work in feature branches, and when we're done with the feature branch, we merge it into the trunk, and it will be that trunk that we would then, when we check it in, would get compiled and tested and deployed to our sys-test environment, and then when we're ready, it would go to our QA environment. When the QA finds an issue with that, they would report that back, and we would usually fix it in the branch again and then merge that branch back into the trunk and things like that. There are occasions where we will do branch deployments to sort of like pseudo QA environments. It gets really complicated when you want to have a lot of different lines of code and test at the same time. We try to limit the work in progress, right? We limit the work in progress so we don't have to have too many streams working. It gets really confusing when you do. But we'll put that into our trunk, and then so it gets, by the way, on the version number thing, I'm really stuck on the version number thing a little bit because when we check it in, what we do is when it builds, TFS assigns a build, it gets a build number, right? And then what we do is we write that build number into our assemblies. So all our assemblies get the version numbers. If you were to grab one of those assemblies, it would have the same number as the build would. When we push it into Octopus, we then create the same release number. And then when we deploy it, you can actually see the on web applications, a lot of times we'll even show the number in the bottom of the application. So at any time, you can sort of trace that version back. And I find it's really helpful to do that. But what gets complicated is when you're doing, so I said, well, we do this. It's kind of easy to set this up, I think. Like in a pure environment, okay, I got a trunk, and I check it in, and it goes down the stream, and we deploy it. But where I think people stumble is when they say, okay, well, what if the trunk, what if that stream of code, that line of code is, well, we find a production bug, but we've already gone into QA with something else, right? Because, we have this continuous cycle going. And so we end up doing, what we call a hotfix. And so what we do is we keep a hotfix branch, right? And we keep that hotfix branch synced with what's in production. And we can also do check-ins into the hotfix branch. And we have a sort of a second stream of our automation that can move the hotfix along the way, parallel in some places to, so like in a QA environment, we can have two different things running at once. UAT, it hops back together and it becomes one UAT. We can only UAT one thing at a time, and we could do more than one if we wanted to make it more complicated. And then it can hop back into production, and then we merge it in. So the tricky part, I think, is honestly setting up that automation so that you don't get into trouble, and that our release numbers can sort of still work together between the hotfix and the regular trunk. It's honestly, this is the part that gets really complicated. Like I said, things are easy. It's really easy to get the first part of it done, and then you get into like real world scenarios where you're like, we're deploying and our release number increments, but we don't want the same kind of increment on a hotfix because that would it's just weird. So we deploy, let's say, version 1 of the software, and then we commit. We're working on some changes, and we're working on the changes for version 2, and so version 2 is in QA right now, and we get a hotfix. So when we deploy the hotfix, we don't want to deploy version 3, which is the hotfix, and then version 2, which is even though I said our numbers are only internal, that's still just really confusing, right? And so, getting that stuff working is kind of confusing. It takes a little bit of thought.
Yeah. Okay. I think we can probably get back to that. So rolling back a little bit more, you had mentioned we were talking about kind of the immutable artifact and everything, and you had mentioned, I believe, configuration, right? You were saying basically environment-specific configuration, or maybe I read into that. But basically, my question is, how do you manage configuration, right? So if you have this immutable artifact that doesn't change as you go through environments, but you need to say, the classic scenario is you're calling a web service, and that web service has a URL, and you need to change that URL for each environment, right? How do you manage different configuration in different environments?
There's a lot of ways to do that. From the simplest and most sort of rudimentary and potentially more error-prone ways to, what you would call more modern, more efficient ways of doing it. And I kind of one of the points I want to make, which I think this is a good time to make, that is, while there's better ways to do it, any way is better than like not doing it, right?
Yeah.
So take baby steps in this stuff, and if you think the way to do that is to deploy my code and keep a copy of the config file and just be careful with it, and then put it into production, like that's better than recompiling your code. Like what's better and better and better as you go through this is to use tools to do these things for you, right?
Yeah.
So we use, I've used a couple different ones over the years, and I've got some experience with using TFS for some of the deployments, but mostly Octopus Deploy lately. And I don't want to necessarily make too many plugs for them, but I will say, since I've started using them, it works really easily, and I'm really happy with the product.
Hey, so, plug away. Maybe we can get them as a sponsor.
Octopus is great. It's a really good product, and they make this easy because this is what they do, right? What I do is I write software, right? So I want to rely on someone else to do this thing for me.
Yep.
I think is always good to know, like, when I should ask for help, right? And so I'm asking them for help. I'm saying, hey, you've got a tool that does this. And so to give an example, right? So for people that aren't familiar with this, the way it works, and to be fair to their competitors, I think most of their competitors do this very similarly, right? Which is to say that I go into the tool and I say, there's a web service connection string named address validation service or something like that, right? And I'm calling a third party to do that. And so I've got, maybe it's a connection string, or maybe it's a URL, or whatever it is. I go into that tool and I say, here's the value I want to use for that in my QA environment, and here's the value I want to use for that in my UAT environment, and here's the value I want to use for that in my production environment. And then the tool knows to use that when it's time to deploy to each of the environments.
And how does it do that? Like it overwrites those settings in the files? Like it literally overwrites the connection string in web config? Or does it render a file that then you look at that configuration file and read in those settings? Or what is the mechanism?
Right. So I don't know how all the tools do it, right? I think there's different ways of doing it. But generally what they do is they write they rewrite the config file for you.
Yeah. And
then the config file is ready to go. And when you, let's say in our case, I do a lot of web development. So when I point IIS at that application, it's there, and its config file is right. It's correct. And there's moving parts there, right? You could say, well, there's still room for error, but it doesn't generally fail. I mean, I'm sure it's going to fail at one point, right? Everything's going to fail, right? At some point, something's going to get messed up.
Yeah.
But, I've done hundreds of deployments with these tools, right? And hundreds is probably an understatement, but this is what they do. They do that one thing, right? And they organize it for you, and it's really pretty nice. That's the thing. When you get in these better toolings, you get a user interface to manage this stuff. You get tracing sort of and logging. So if I go back and look at a deployment log from one of these tools, I can go in and say, oh, it did change this value for me. It did these things. You can sort of look back, and it keeps track of that, which is if I hacked this myself and came up with my own way to do it, I wouldn't have the power of all the tooling and the logging and the accountability and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So you keep your configuration values or configuration settings in Octopus. You kind of use the Octopus UI to define those settings.
Yeah, we do use their UI, and there's some.
But you're not checking in configuration settings like into source control, like the production database password or connection string. You're not like checking that stuff into.
Well, yeah, right. We don't do that because that just breaks this even more, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to have these things checked in. By the way, if you check it in, then you run the risk of it also being used in the wrong environment and stuff like that. I think you really want to isolate these values to where they belong. I think some of these systems now, and I don't want to speak incorrectly, but I think there are some of them, including Octopus, there's features where there's some sort of accountability, like you can. I don't want to say this. You can keep track of these changes and stuff like that, so you can like sort of roll back even your change. Like it's almost like a commit. Like we're used to source control for our code, and I think they're starting to treat these systems as like batches of changes that you sort of save, and I can say, oh, how has that changed over time and things like that. So it's not just the current value, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're using, like you said, you're using Octopus to kind of store the configuration for the environments. So what's the development experience like? I'm the developer now, and I want to work on something. So this is kind of a two-part question. I want to work on something. Do I have to, after I get the code down, do I have to do a lot of setup just to get it running locally? And the second part of the question is, do you have to architect your software, or is it better to architect your software in a certain manner so that it's DevOps ready? If you got this big enchilada kind of project where everything's got to work, that's hard. That's hard to automate anyway. You're already kind of in trouble.
Yeah, I think you have two good points. The second one I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to forget what the first one was because that's the way my brain works. But
that's all right. I'll ask again.
The second one, in particular, this is where I was talking about it. This kind of goes back to the point about it being like a methodology, and that the team has to embrace it, because you're totally right. You have to think about this stuff from the beginning. It helps if you develop your code in a, like, say, DevOps friendly way, right? I think that is a good way to do it. Now, you were also asking. I remember you were asking about the development way of, like what happens when I just get code from source control, right? New machine, right. I get code. How much work do I have to do to get to go to work? Right. So should be none, because the values we check in are the development values, right? We try to keep our machines consistent. So we run local versions of SQL Server on our machine, so that we should have the same, and the database name should be the same. Like, you don't want to have one developer with one name of a database and another person, you have to have some enforcement of consistency and things like that. So let's just say I have a lot of times we write apps that send mail messages for whatever reason, right? And often, a lot of times what we use in development is we'll use like a drop folder where the mail gets dropped in a folder, right? So if I keep my drop folder at like C/email drop, then you have to have C/email drop, because if you want to change it to be D/email drop and you check that in, then it's not going to work for me, right? So keeping that stuff consistent. I'm a big believer in I should be able to check out code from source control, or get, whether you're calling it checkout or not. I should be able to get it on my machine and run it.
You're an F5 ability kind of guy. Like,
you should be, right?
We've said that on the show.
That's before. A cool way of putting it. I like that.
Yeah.
That's Chris's. You can use it.
Yeah. So
F5 ability. Yeah. I mean, isn't that the worst? Like when you're someone's got a problem. There's a problem with some code, and no one's around. So you say, "Oh, I'll get that."
Nobody can build it.
And then you're like, and then of course there's a problem. So someone's looking over your shoulder, and you feel like a moron because you're like,
you don't remember.
You totally want to get the code down and hit F5. But that's a pretty .NET thing. Like if we said that on a Node show, they'd be, "What are you talking about?" So. So we talked a little bit about we've talked a lot about automation as a part of DevOps, and I think it's a big part, because for me, if I have to take a step back, it's about the development team taking more ownership in how the code gets deployed than maybe we used to. It wasn't, I can think of some past lives where once the code was built, we just said, okay, cool. In fact, we might even have someone called a build engineer whose job was to actually produce bits. And that person would then deliver those bits to operations people who would then kill themselves to get it onto machines that were totally different from what you were working on. And it's like we're taking more ownership, saying we're not trying to control, but take ownership in that we're going to be part of this process because we're going to understand it so well that we automate it instead of just writing some stuff down and saying, hey guys, have a good time. Just don't call me this Saturday when you
trying to upgrade.
deploy it. And I think that's where a lot of organizations start, because automation it's the obvious one. It's let's have a more repeatable process, something we can rely on because we are automating this every step of the way from development to staging. And then maybe, I think a lot of orgs don't take this step, honestly, but maybe even into prod. And it sounds like you're trying to get there where your prod worksheet was shrinking from a page to even a link.
Well, the link is the link to Octopus, right? So we are automated. Yeah. It's just that I need to tell them to push the button, right?
Right.
In our best cases, we are fully automated into production, right? And, it is different than it used to be. Now, to be fair to that scenario, you mentioned, which is that, what'd you call it? Like the build manager or whatever that role was.
I've thought of past lives where I build it, the developers basically said, yeah, we think we're good. that was the sign off. Hey, let's go get the build guy to build some bits.
Yeah.
And
so we're done.
Remember those days, right?
Well, some places still need that build manager, I think, to be fair. Especially when you're writing like applications where like different teams build write parts of the application or something like that. There's still that like person that somehow like puts them together and organizes that stuff. But yeah, we do take ownership of the deployment process as developers, right? Because we know how our application is going to run. Generally, and again, I don't mean to speak disparagingly about anyone, but the guys that run the servers don't really know how an application works necessarily, especially when we're dealing with, like, our job is to stay up with the newest technology for, let's say, ASP.NET or whatever it is. And, whether I'm using, .NET Core or whatever, but these guys, their job is to understand server technology, right? Yeah. And it's a simpler, what's that?
How to patch things on the server.
How to patch things, yeah, right.
Like, sometimes they get good at just reading the tea leaves in our logs.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's sad when this happens, and I take it as failure now but it happens a lot where they've learned to read that the tea leaves in the log. I know it says blah, 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 but what it really means is we ran out of file space on a certain SAN.
Yeah.
And they figured that out, and they haven't even told R&D or dev or whatever you call your group that you figured it out. And that's, to me, okay, you don't have DevOps then, because you're not coming back on the monitoring side and the measurement side. And I think a lot of orgs don't get there because the automation is the first step. It's the first piece to do. Now you got to figure out the back end, which is when things go wrong, how does that get exposed to the whole org in a responsible way so that everyone sees it, even developers can take ownership and say, whoa, that bad thing that happened this weekend, we should not only make sure that never happens again, we got to correct that error message because nobody knew what it meant.
So how do you deal with that, Andy? I mean, what is your approach for instrumentation and logging? Like, how do you make meaningful?
And this goes along with a question. This will probably make you all happy. This goes along with a question I got from Anthony in the chat, who basically asked, do you get a stack trace for errors that happen in prod? And I felt like, well, that kind of let's bring all that together and talk about the monitoring and measurement and how does engineering respond to problems. How do you make that? When is that DevOps and when is it? No, we're not at the DevOps stage yet on the monitoring, measurement, exception handling, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So what we do is, and this is a place where we have room for growth, right? You're never done with any of this stuff. Right? You're always striving to get better and better and take steps into this process, right? So, if anyone's listening and says, "Oh my God, I'm so far out," like, no, just get started and take a piece of this and do something and keep improving. We do central logging to like a central database from production applications. At the very root, at the core of things, you have to do logging of exceptions and things like that. Now, there are times when you were asking, do I get like a dump from like the operations team? There are times when my log, for some reason, isn't getting the error. Like something failed. Maybe the logging failed or something like that. So. So again, I don't have access to the production machine. So then I have to go and get one of the operations infrastructure guys to sit down and say, "Hey, can you log on this machine? Let's take a look at the event viewer or something like that, or the IIS log, or whatever it is." And we work together on those problems. But it's generally our problem. Like there shouldn't be problems in production that are like not the developer's fault.
Sure. Yeah.
Yes, a machine can run out of memory or something.
Right. There's environmental problems.
Yeah, there's environmental problems, but those guys, it should be pretty. They should be able to diagnose those things pretty well, and hopefully they have good monitoring on that kind of stuff. Right. And I will say that there was a time, and there's probably still some smaller teams at my organization that will rely on the infrastructure team and say, "Well, my app's not working. Like, why isn't it working?" And they're like, "What do we know? Like, we don't write the code. We don't know how." So we work together on these things, but I think the problem should be ours. And so we do like logging from all the environments. So we have all our errors go into a common logging place, and then we can analyze those errors and look back at that when there's a problem. The place where I would honestly say we have room for improvement is the proactive part of it, right? How many organizations, I don't know if you guys are doing it, so I really like to hear if you guys are doing similar things to what we're doing, but how many organizations are looking at those error logs preemptively saying, well, no one reported a problem, but there is a problem. And it's hard to do when you have, unfortunately, we have certain legacy applications that log more things than you would like them to log. Not like they throw a lot of exceptions, right? Sure, but they're exceptions that don't necessarily affect the application running.
You ignore them.
Yeah. And so that's such a bad pattern.
Yeah.
Now your error log isn't really a valid log. What you really want to get down to the point is when one error hits that log, we got a problem.
Yeah.
And now it's easy to monitor logs.
So that is one of my guidelines that I have for my teams. I'm very interested to hear about any kind of rules or practices or guidelines that you have. But I have two guidelines. One of them is that exactly, right? In all logging frameworks, all modern logging frameworks now, we have the ability to kind of classify a log at a certain error level. So anything that you say is an error, meaning an actual application error, not a user error, but an application error, assume that you're getting a phone call or a text, right? And so you don't come in one day and the error log is flooded with logs and you're just now figuring it out. You knew because your phone was getting flooded with text, right? So anything under that, if it's just something that you want to log, or a quote, a user error, like a data error, a data condition that you just kind of want to log for kind of posterity's sake, for maybe troubleshooting or something, but your code didn't fail, versus diagnostics or whatever. Just be very mindful of that. The other one that I have is, and it's practically impossible. I say it almost as a joke, but I am serious. When you are developing the code, write the log message to include the information that you need when you are troubleshooting something that goes wrong with this code in production. Right. Which is impossible because you can never know what is actually going to happen in production that you're going to be troubleshooting. But I so much see when developers write logs, it's more like writing debug statements. When we had to write stuff without debuggers in the past, where if I got to line 100, then this condition must be true. Next step. Yeah. Or the value at line 100 is this, and then the value at line 110 is this.
Open database. Database responded.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not really, maybe that's helpful, but that's not really helpful. It is when when the ops person in particular, or the developer looking at the logs, or looking at this, and you're seeing, what was happening at the time? What was the state of the application at the time?
That's what you want. What was the state of the application?
What was I trying to do? Yeah. So do you have any, any practices, any guidelines, or any technical approaches or tools or anything that you use in that area to kind of help with that?
No, in a word, honestly. We're all working on stuff, right? So I could use help in that area. One of the things, certainly there's some things that you can log that are easier than others. What is the ID of the whatever it was you were working on at the time, whatever the widget was that was getting processed, to keep track of what it was and try to log that, and so you can get to a little bit more information and some information about the state of the application. But the one thing I've learned to do though is to try to never have object not set. Object reference not set to
null reference
object, right? Yeah, the null. To me, that's one of the hardest things to diagnose, right? You're like, what? So I try to make sure that a method, and now we're getting into a little bit more programming than we are, in like actual tooling or something like that. But I try to handle those with those argument exceptions and check all my arguments to make sure that that's not going to happen, because I just find that it's
worthless.
What's that?
It's worthless. It doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah,
you have a problem in production, but you don't have any right information to deal with it.
Right.
Yeah.
But
also the part of monitoring that. And listen, I'm gonna throw these product names out there without having used them, but things like this, like what Hockey App and Application Insights and those things are for, is to say, oh, this is how much load the server's taking and how long requests are being served on average, and that's supposed to help you make decisions like, should we scale up? And that's like the back end of DevOps, the measurement side, that I think is hard to get to, because you're not, that part's important, but it's not producing new features for the business. So you don't necessarily get business support to measure.
Yep.
Because they say, measure what? Everything's working fine, right?
Yep.
Well, do we know?
Yep.
How do we really know how bad the experience is for our users?
Yep.
Well, so in ideally, right, and that's a place where App Insights is pretty cool, right? And so from my knowledge of it, I'm impressed. It's really cool. There's a lot of information in there, and it's good. So I did want to touch upon what you said about how you're not getting business value out of that stuff, but you are. Right. So what we need to do is we need to convince our companies to embrace this whole process. And what embracing that does is it says to them, well, yeah, it's not a feature, but there's a feature you want, right? You want that new search feature in the application, right? I'm not going to get to it because I'm too busy working on problems.
Yeah.
Right. And so the whole idea, this is where it becomes it's bigger than that. And it's this methodology, is the DevOps, is that by embracing that, that let's say all that information, App Insights and Hockey App, and by analyzing that and utilizing that, you keep that cycle moving fast, right?
Yeah.
Because you're solving the problems before they're big, or you're solving the problems quickly. And then you're able to move on to that next great feature that they want.
Yeah, that's kind of a difficult conversation to have, though, right? That's almost admitting that you wrote bad code.
Well,
it's probably a whole other show, right? We could probably get into
we can get into the whole idea of a car, right? A car sooner or later is going to break down, or it's going to need an oil change.
Yeah.
Software is the same thing. It's going to need maintenance. It's just part of the process.
Well,
or even just that you made a choice. When you built the app, you made a choice that you thought was the most performant or whatever, and then users don't use it that way. Whoops. It really wasn't the right choice. And measurement told us, hey, we should really scale up this service. We need more of them.
Well, scaling up a service.
It's really abstract, right? Because I'm just sort of making it up. We don't have a concrete example, but that's the purpose of it, is to help you say, bad. It's not because, oh, we wrote terrible code. It's that, no, we made what we thought were the best choices.
Sure.
And we're finding out that real world usage isn't necessarily going the way we thought.
But I mean, I guess that is a very legitimate conversation that you can have with the business folks. But I'm talking about having this conversation with the business folks, saying exactly what Andy just said, right? Look, because I completely agree with what Andy just said. Like, that is what you have to say. You go to the business and say, look, I can't deliver what you want because I'm too busy fixing all these problems that keep deriving because of whether or not you actually say it, because of the way the application is built right now, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
I need time. I need to spend your money to go and change the application, and you're not going to see any immediate value out of that. In fact, in the immediate term, you're actually going to be waiting for value, right? I'm going to be pausing delivering you direct value. It's just a difficult conversation to have. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm completely agreeing with you, Andy. It's just a difficult conversation to have.
Right. And so, of course, it differs as to where you work and what your situation is.
Yeah.
The type of organization you're at has a lot of influence on how you can have these conversations. But in a totally unrelated topic, but similar, I was talking to one people on one of my teams this week, and they were worried about someone bringing up an issue in a Scrum setting, and someone brought up an issue, and they said, well, the business was in there because the business is part of the team, right? And the business was in there, and they heard about a problem we had in the IT department, and we shouldn't let that happen. I said, we got to be more confident.
Yeah,
we have to be able to let and it's the same thing that applies in the thing you were saying. Now, I don't want to walk into the CEO's office and tell her I wrote bad code, right?
Yeah.
But in general, I have to be able to be comfortable enough that I do a good job.
Yeah.
And not every piece of code I write is perfect. And I have to be able to go to them and say, hey, there's a problem in this code and I need to fix it. Now, there's a time and a place, right? You can't do that all the time. You got to sort of pick and choose your battles. But I just think that it's easy to say. I work at a place where I'm fortunate enough to be pretty well respected. The people I work for, I like them and they like me and all that. Not everybody has that scenario, right? But if you can't go to your boss's, I'm throwing this out as a theory here, but if you can't go to your boss's office and tell him you made a mistake, maybe you're in the wrong place. And if you're fortunate enough and you can look for something, maybe that's a smell.
Yeah. No, I mean, we don't need to linger on it. I'm just saying it's a tough conversation. Not saying telling anyone that you made a mistake, right? Not saying that you can't do it or that they're going to freak out. It's just it requires a lot of, as you said, confidence.
Well, the other idea, is to blame it on the guy before you, right? Which
I do
that a lot.
I do that all the time.
Oh, yeah. We all do that.
Joe who left. He made that decision.
God, this guy was a total disaster.
So, speaking of confidence, are you still afraid of production? Are you confident when you go to production? Or are you still afraid of going to production, even with all this stuff in place?
Well, some aspects I am and some aspects I'm not, right? I'm confident. I am really confident in our deployment process, right? We've worked really hard on that, and I'm really confident in that. I'm not as confident in quite frankly, right, on our ability to test a million scenarios.
Sure.
We don't have enough test automation in our organization. A lot of places, right, we're all getting better, right? And so we have a lot of it, but we write complex software and complex products, right? And I think a lot of people do that. And so it's hard to know that the software holds up under all the different scenarios.
Yeah.
And what scares me, that's the stuff that scares me. And how many times have you had someone do something on the first day after you deploy and you're like, they tried that? And I look through let's say I look through the database and I say, no one's done that in like 15 years or something like that.
Yeah.
And the day I deployed, someone did that thing again. And I'm like,
yeah,
and it didn't work, right?
I like to say that there's a saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy. I like to say no code base survives contact with the user.
Yeah, it's so hard to know what a user's gonna do. So, but what do I have confidence in though? I have confidence in a lot of our process. I have confidence in our deployment, and I have confidence in the methodology, if you will, and the process we have in place that we can fix that problem quickly.
Yeah.
Right. And so, not to say, I'm never trying to say that it's okay to ship a bad product, right?
Yeah.
But you have to have the confidence that when it does happen, and it will, that we will not, it will not be a disaster. Like we can recover from this quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes, in no time at all. Right. And I think that's an important part, right? That's part of your safety net, is like this thing that you build up so you can be more confident. I am very confident in our deployment process, though. I'm really happy to say that.
So, real quickly, like lightning round question: roll forward or roll back?
Roll forward.
Yeah.
Database gets you into trouble every time. If you don't have any database changes, roll back. But you know what? A user already entered some data in that doesn't work under the old scenario. Roll forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. All right, Chris, Todd, you got anything else? I have one
lightning question. I like these lightning questions.
Oh, I have a quick lightning question. Hopefully it's a quick question. So we talked a little bit about you have this great automated process and you're pretty happy with it. How do you deal with certain things that maybe you were talking a little bit before about a service? You have a certain service, it only updates once a year. Do you have like things like that automated too, or is that still some of the areas where the last mile, right?
Oh, yeah.
You're focusing on the 80%, but there's like these 3 services over here that they just never gonna get automated.
So yeah, it's worse than that or bigger than that. The problem is bigger than that. We have applications that we work on somewhat often that still aren't in the process yet. It takes a while when you have a large portfolio to get there. What we try to do is, of course, focus on the most vulnerable things first, the most active things. But we have a way to go, and we have different teams that are at different stages in this. So my team, I think, is doing a pretty good job. We're moving everything new gets that way. We try to say, if you're changing the app, it's time to fix the process around it.
Or at least improve the process.
Yeah, but
way of thinking.
But we're not there yet. And if we have time, if I have a couple minutes, that really brings up a story that I want to tell. If that's okay. So the best time to do this stuff, meaning to put this automation in place, is now, right? Not tomorrow, right? So the story I tell in a lot of presentations, and you guys maybe have heard me tell this story before, but I always say, we always start out with good intentions. I'm really excited. I've been reading all about this automated deployment, continuous integration. This is really good stuff. I think we're gonna do this now in my team. And so they just asked us to write a new application. So I think this is going to be the one. We're going to do automation. So you say, all right, I'm gonna start building the app, and I start building the app, and I say, you know what, I want to do the automation, but I'm really excited, and the business kind of want to see a couple of previews of what this thing can do, right? And just, locally, of course, not deployed to production, but little stuff. So, all right, I'll show it to them, and I'm just going to do the couple features. And then they say, hey, can you do a couple more? Or there's a problem with it. And, oh, okay, I'm going to do the automation. No, it's coming. Like, I'm not going live, but we got to have this automation.
It's on the backlog. Do automation.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, it's a great one. It's in the backlog. Exactly, right? So we say we're going to do that. And then what happens is we're getting closer and closer to the date. And I say, listen, I got it, guys. Don't worry about it. Because we have locked our features in, and we've got a week before we go to production. And that's our last ditch. But we are not going live in production. We're going to build the automation. Now, first of all, I've already deployed to, let's say, QA or to these other environments like 50 times manually. And spent so much time doing that, right? But okay, so here I come. I'm up in the final stretch. I got it. I'm about to do this automation stuff. It's going to be great. And someone comes in and says, you know what? Everything's great in UAT. The users love it, but we forgot there's one more feature. And can you get that in? And you're like, oh, I had this time set aside. I'm going to do my automation. I'm going to build my release process. But all right, you know what? It's the first time we're going to production, and that's actually kind of like the easiest one because I'm not really changing things. I'm just deploying it for the first time. So what we're going to do is we're going to deploy to production manually this time. But tomorrow, or the next day, we're not doing any new features. we're going to build our automation process. And so we do that, right? And of course, it goes smoothly. And of course, the next day, though, there's a bug, right? Not with the deployment, but with just the software. It's not working. And now I'm like working on bug fixes. And then we get done with those bugs and we're like, well, we already promised them this new feature in sprint, 2 or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know what I'm going to do? I will do the deployment next week.
Next time.
You know how the story ends.
Right. Because you talk to your boss and he says, okay, so the code's fully tested, right? You're completely done coding. But we're not going to production yet. You're going to need another week to go into production. Yep. Why?
Yeah. And so he says ship it.
Automated deployment.
Right.
Yeah. Just ship.
And so this process, this mistake goes on for months.
Yeah.
Because you just don't get to it. And
it's about priorities, right? I mean, it's,
right. But the best time to do it is day one, because the truth is no one's watching, right? Yeah. No one cares if you take like another day or two to like set this stuff up,
Right. Well, and you said it, right? You spent so much time manually deploying in that whole time. If you had just done it up front, presumably, it would have saved you time in the long run, right?
Right. Those 50 times I deployed for the testers to see it, and my manual deploy, I kept screwing it up anyway because I was doing it manually, right? And so the lost time. It's just so.
That's now you'll save yourself time.
So on day one, what do you say? The first thing you do when you create an application, check it in, right? Immediately. The next thing you do, like set up this automation. It's also easier to set it up when the application's simple,
small, right?
Because
there is no complexity.
Right. And so how many configuration values do I need to add into that tool? One, right? Yeah. But later, if I have to I'm going to have to put 50 configuration values. It's just easier to do them like, along the way and stuff like that. So
plus, as you're building this new project, you're thinking every step of the way from day one, you're thinking, okay, now I got to automate this part of the deployment.
Yeah. You said it before, right? You got to think like DevOps first, right?
Yeah.
Chris, that's what you said. Like, do you want to do that? And right. So if you do that right off the bat, you're really like sort of forcing your own hand to make sure that you're building it sort of like DevOps ready. And so, if that, I think this one of the takeaways to me is like the most important part of any of this stuff is do it now. And the other one is do something meaning it doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be better than what you did yesterday. Try something new.
That is basically the theme of this podcast, right? Is our kind of tagline, our motto is, we're real world developers. We're not podcasters for a living. We have day jobs and we go and we do this stuff in the real world. And so what we try to bring into every show is what can people start doing tomorrow? Even if it's like something little, what is that one thing that they can take 20 minutes or an hour to do tomorrow that they don't have to get buy-in from their boss and their boss's boss and, change their whole company tomorrow. But like you say, the best time to do this is now and get started right now. What can people take back to work with them and start doing tomorrow? Like, let's say I'm in a total waterfall environment with lots of manual build and deployment steps. Like, what do I focus on first? And like, how do I learn to do what you've done? And just like, where do I start?
That's a hard question. Where do you start? There's so many things, we touched upon a lot about deployments, but there's just so much more to this, right? We talked about, I think a good place to start. Well, first of all, if you don't have source control, start there. Seriously, right? I mean, you got to have source control, right? Yeah. And then I think the next thing to do is sort of like work down the pipeline, which I would think is continuous integration, right? Build your software off. Don't build on your machine. I mean, obviously when you're compiled to run it or something, you're building it on your machine, but get it off your machine, get it in an independent environment, get continuous integration, get something that says someone checked in code and broke the build, and don't let that happen, right? Start there. That's not too hard a thing to do, especially, it depends on your environment. If you've got, let's say, if you're using TFS, for example, which has like a lot of features built into it, you can get continuous integration in minutes. It's easy to do, and there's no cost. Like one of the things you said is, you got to get buy-in, like to go and install, let's say, a tool, let's say it's Octopus or whatever it is. I need the infrastructure team support. I need like a lot. Like I can't just do it on my own. But there are certainly some free tools that you can use as well to do that. But I think in a lot of lot of .NET shops, TFS is popular.
If you're using TFS for source control, you've got TFS build.
Yeah, I'm not saying that you should use necessarily TFS build. I'm not saying that's the best build tool. I happen to use it, right? But what I'm saying is, if you've already got it in the door.
Right. Well, it's also not that simple because it does need infrastructure. You do need build controllers and agents and all that stuff too.
But yeah. You
got the licenses, is what I meant.
Yeah, you can get away with one build controller can do a lot.
Yes.
Obviously. And so you can get that one. I guess the first one is free.
Yeah.
Although I'm not an expert on licensing or anything.
Let's stay away from that.
But I think the first one is free. Yeah. And like I said, if you've already got that in the door, it's a pretty easy next step. Yeah. If you're not using that, then you can get some free tools. But you got to run some of these things up the pipeline because some organizations don't want you even using free tools or licensing problems. But I think continuous integration is a really good place to start.
Yeah. Cool. So how about actually getting into production, getting the deployments automated? What about in that space? Are there any kind of quick wins or areas to focus on, like things that really tripped you up in the beginning, or?
Well, before I used Octopus, I had to sort of roll my own, which is to say I wrote like batch scripts, essentially, that did this. And that's a fairly easy way to get started.
Yeah. So you would say that's not a waste? That's actually a good way to get started simply?
If the company's on board and everybody says, yeah, what do you want to do? You want to spend a couple $grand to get a tool? Like I say, get the tool, right? But if there's pushback on that, or if there's some delay where they say, well, we're going to do it next year or something like that, then I say, no. What baby step can you take? Automate it yourself. Write a batch script that takes that same application and can install it from one environment to the next, where now you're giving that infrastructure team, again, you're back to that one instruction, run this batch file. Take as much of try to rule out any place where there's error, right? That's actually a really good thing is you say, well, where to start? Well, what problem do you have? Don't solve problems you don't have, right? What's the problem that in your environment you have? So if you spend a lot of time dealing with the fact that every time you do a deployment, half the application is missing, then focus on that. And maybe a batch file would be a good way to do it, where they can't mess that up. Yeah, if you go to an environment where every time you deploy, the development config values end up in production, you've got a sort of a different problem, right? So try to focus on like what would save me time, right? And that's going to be different for everybody.
Right. Be selfish about it. Be lazy and selfish.
Well,
qualities of a good developer.
Yeah. That's why I like DevOps, because I'm lazy. I don't want to deal with these problems, right? I mean, you could call that efficient, but I'm calling myself lazy. I don't want to deal with problems.
Good developers. Automate what
we
you
talk
can.
a lot about code being part of DevOps, like the application. What advice might you have for the DevOps of your data, your database? And I mean both directions, not just schema changes. How do you get those into staging and prod? But I think a lot of developers deal with we have a problem and I need a snapshot from staging, or let's just admit it, a snapshot from production. And how does that fit in with DevOps? Rolling that forward, getting that back. Maybe you're not dealing with these exact issues either, but I think a lot of developers do.
I am dealing with those issues. I think you're right. It is an important part of the whole. It is all part of the process, right? And again, every scenario and every organization has different problems that they have to solve and different ways of looking at this. But remember, I said not all our applications are at the place we want them to be in this whole process, right? But the ones that we have flowing really well, which is most of my team's, the bigger applications that we work on are automated, and we have automated database deployment, right? Now, again, it's easy to talk about deploying applications. I think there's easy ways to do it. It's not always simple, but when you get into the database world, it's a whole different story. Database deployments, they kind of suck, I think, like keeping them synchronized and things like that. That's where the problems are. That's where the rollback is just never a good scenario, And So we've used a couple of different processes to keep the database environment synchronized. We've used the idea of like a data project or a DAC pack, which I think is a really great way to do it. We currently use scripts that we write ourselves, and we have a process that runs the scripts in each environment, but we don't manually execute them, right? That's all built into the process. So it's pretty easy for us to get an environment forward to the place we want to go, but it's really hard to get an environment to go back, right? And that's often a problem. One place where we run into that is, like I said earlier, like, so we're let's say testing at version 2, but we have a bug in version 1, and we want to get that version 1 back into the test environment, and that test environment's database has already been modified. Like, that's complicated, right? This is the part where I think, it just sounds really easy. And in the real world, this stuff is really hard, really hard. One of the things we do have a problem, we run into the exact problems you talked about, Chris, like trying to diagnose a production problem without the production data, right? Because we just can't reproduce the situation. And we're trying to think of ways to do that. Right. And so this is where you go back to what you said, design for DevOps, right? How do you got to think about these problems when you're building the software. I'm writing software, so what's going to happen when there's a production problem? How am I going to resolve it? And often you can make a decision at the time that says, okay, I'm going to build my data model, or I'm going to build my application in such a way that is going to enable me to fix these things, right? So one of the things we're talking about changing is we have certain application, or one application in particular, that when it saves its data, and I'm not getting into the specifics, but when it saves its data, its thing, let's just say it was a car. Let's say I'm saving information about a car, and I write to the body table and the chassis table and the wheel table and all these different things, right? These are all just pieces of the car. But in my case, these aren't really reusable pieces, right? These are only pieces that are only important to the car, right? To my car. And so we're leaning towards like more of a document database kind of strategy, right? Because that enables me to just take that car. It's just one thing in the database, right? And just be able to export that, import that into my other database, as long as there's no proprietary information, like secure data or something like that. So, but that's like a strategy decision that you got to make up front, right? And the point isn't really, or the solution isn't exactly that. That's a solution, but the solution is going back to your point about thinking about DevOps and thinking about problem solving when you're writing software, right? Like Jess mentioned earlier, like when you're logging, can you log information that's going to actually be helpful, right? You have to think about the problem that might occur, right? And of course, we're not clairvoyant. If we were, we wouldn't have bugs in the code in the first place, I guess, right? But you have to. This is where we need to get smarter. This is the like sort of modern software architect's job, I think, is to think about like how can I build this better to prevent these problems in the future, right? Not that we're not going to have bugs, but writing an application such that
be proactive around it.
Yeah, being proactive.
Yeah, awesome. So any other closing thoughts? Is there anything that you wish you knew when you had started down this road, or just any other high-level observations or any funny stories?
Plenty of long nights and stuff figuring it out, I would say. I'm sure there's some funny stories, but in spite of the fact that I keep saying, well, this is easy and that's easy and stuff like that, it's going to take you a while to do something the first time. And so don't get frustrated when it just doesn't work, because, you set up this automation and it works. And then the second time it doesn't work in the next environment because the permissions weren't right. And, oh, I thought I could do this on that machine, or, it can be painstaking. It can be painstaking, but it will be worth it, right? Suffer through a little bit of some of that stuff, because you'll really be happy in the end, I think is what it is. Like it's don't get down on yourself. Like, parts of it are easy, but putting the puzzle together is complex. And, but try, just, pick a piece and do it. And, I'll tell you, here's a good piece of advice, which I would say I've probably done wrong from experience. You can't allow one person on the team to understand this aspect of the thing, right? So it's pretty often that a software architect, and I'm not talking about, let's just say a software architect, not me, but a software architect figures this all out, right? And then says, hey guys, we've got DevOps, we've got automation, we've got whatever we're calling it, and then it's in place, but the other people on the team don't understand it.
Black magic.
Or they understand it. So here's the thing. So you say, well, I'm going to show them, I'm going to give them that 1 hour. Like, we're going to go into one of the conference rooms. I'm going to give you the hour-long talk and show you how the thing works. But they didn't set it up, right? They didn't live through the problems you had. And so they're really not going to know how to fix it. And so I think good advice that, I could follow, because is to do this as a group. Now, again, hard to do, right? Because you're working on software at the same time.
Yeah.
But don't let that knowledge belong to one person, because the other problem is you're going to end up owning it, and you probably don't want to own it, because you're the one that then gets the call every time. Like, I am at work, I am the TFS guy, I am the octopus guy, because I set it up and I know more about it. So try to encourage everyone to get involved and solve the problems. I will say that this is a place where I do try to push back. People say, well, this isn't working. How do I fix it? I say, Google it.
Yeah.
Like, it's out there. A lot of these things have great documentation. People have been through these problems. Like, don't just ask me every time. Because you're just not going to learn it right.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. And with that, you listener, what is your definition of DevOps? How do you manage and deploy your applications? We'd love to know. Please leave a comment on the website, staticvoidpodcast.com, or send an email to comments@staticvoidpodcast.com. And as always, if you have a topic you'd like us to discuss on the show, please feel free to let us know through those same channels. We want to make sure that we're talking about the things that you actually want to hear about. Todd, Chris, thanks for the chat.
Yeah, Andy, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, Andy, it was great having you
watching tonight and participating in chat. That was great.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh yeah, and we really loved the 4 people who are actually watching live. It's a new record.
Yeah.
Four is our new reget.
Guys, I do want to say thanks for having me. I also want to say this was a great practice run. Are we going to record it now?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. We'll get started right after this on the real one.
And, yeah, no, great. Thank you, as always, Andy. We really loved having you on, and thanks for taking the time to.
Appreciate it.
I know it's late. It's past midnight, and the 3 of us are used to this. I know you're not quite.
Totally my pleasure.
But you're used to staying up past midnight to deal with the DevOps issues, right?
That's right. That's right. My phone's ringing right now. There's a problem at work.
It's a build process.
Thank you, listener, for spending the time with us. Whether you are watching live or listening to the recording after the fact, we hope that you enjoyed the discussion, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Static Void Podcast. And stop. Also, a new record for length of show.
In shortness or length?
Oh, no, length.
I hope that's cool. In terms of the length of my answers, I'm never.
I might try and go through and edit some of the superfluous stuff out, but I don't know about Chris and Todd, but I don't really I don't really focus on the length, right? Well, we really try and control the conversation while we're going and just make sure that it doesn't get too long and just keep an eye on it. But if it ends up being an hour 20, an hour 25, and that's all the content is good and deserves to be there.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, as long as we didn't like go off on a tangent for 20 minutes, then it's an hour and a half show. Who cares?
Yeah. I mean, you guys think, I mean, it's always, wait, am I recording still? I hit stop. Oh, I hit the record. I hit the wrong button. That's good. Sorry, we'll have a couple extra comments of mine.
That's all right.
I should hit save now, right?
Oh yeah, save
Export.
immediately.
You save
What is it? Save project?
Export.
I don't save it first?
No, don't save the project. You don't need to save the project.
Okay, hang on. Before we do anything, I'm gonna share my screen, right? I don't want to mess this up. So
you can just go ahead and export audio. Go, yeah, share your screen again. Oh, hold on.
I'm sharing it now. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
You can probably get rid of the first audio track, maybe.
Yeah, I thought I deleted it, but I guess I just
right click on it. Yeah. Okay, we can stop the broadcast. The internet doesn't.
Oh yeah, right.
Hey everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
That's how it works.
See ya.